Some people walk into a room, and something happens. They notice a quick expression on someone's face, a nearly invisible change in someone's tone of voice, that strange half-second of silence in a conversation, the kind that disappears before anyone else even notices it, except them. While everyone else keeps talking like nothing happened, that person already knows something has changed. And do you know the most common thing these people hear their entire lives? You're overthinking. You're imagining things. But psychology tells a very different story. Some minds are naturally more sensitive to patterns, emotions, and subtle social signals. It's not weakness. And it's not anxiety. It's simply a different way of processing the world. And it shows up through some very specific behaviors. In this video, you'll discover 10 signs that your mind notices things most people completely miss. And if you've often felt like you see details others ignore, pay close attention, because there's a good chance you'll recognize yourself in more than one of them. Sign 10. You can sense when something is wrong, even if you can't explain why. Sometimes it's just a feeling. You're talking to someone. They say everything is fine, but something doesn't quite add up. Their tone of voice is slightly different from usual. The response comes a little too quickly. The smile looks right, but it doesn't reach the eyes. Nothing obvious. Nothing you can clearly point to. And yet, you feel it. Something has changed. What's interesting is that psychology actually explains this phenomenon. The human brain is capable of detecting subtle social and emotional signals long before the conscious mind fully processes what is happening. In other words, you notice it before you understand it. And that feeling that many people dismiss as just an impression is very rarely just an impression. But sensing that something is wrong is only the beginning, because some people go even further than that. They don't just notice that something has changed. They begin to pick up emotions that no one is expressing out loud. And that leads us to the next sign. Sign 9. You notice emotions people try to hide. Imagine a group gathering. Everyone is talking, laughing, interacting normally. But one person is slightly quieter than usual. They're still participating, but something feels different. Maybe it's the way they're holding their glass. The way they look away when certain topics come up. A subtle stiffness in their shoulders that wasn't there before. For most people in the room, none of this exists. But some people notice it immediately. Not because they're actively searching for it, but because their brain automatically registers these small shifts in behavior. It's almost as if there's a second layer of communication happening in parallel with the conversation. And only a few people can hear it. And over time, being able to notice so much starts to change the way these people behave socially. Because when you're constantly picking up multiple signals at once, speaking less and observing more begins to make perfect sense. And that leads us to the next sign. Sign 8. You observe more than you speak. In many social situations, while others are talking non-stop, you're paying attention, watching how people react. Who seems comfortable? Who is clearly nervous? Who completely changes their behavior depending on who is around? In a group of friends, for example, while the conversation flows normally, you may start noticing things no one else seems to see. Who is trying to impress someone? Who feels uncomfortable but is pretending not to? Who agrees with everything just to avoid any kind of conflict? And then people ask you, "Why are you so quiet?" But the truth is, you're not quiet because you have nothing to say. You speak less because you're busy understanding what's happening. For some minds, observing isn't passivity. It's processing. And when someone spends a lot of time observing behaviors and subtle reactions, something interesting begins to happen. They start to recognize patterns. Not just in situations, but in people themselves. And that leads us to the next sign. Sign 7. You begin to notice patterns in people's behavior. After observing many similar situations, certain things start to repeat. You notice that some people completely change depending on who is around them. Others react the same way every time they feel pressured. And some appear extremely kind in front of everyone, but behave very differently once the audience changes. Here's a simple example. After spending some time around someone, you may start to realize that this person always makes promises when they feel excited, but rarely follows through later. The enthusiasm in the moment is real. The intention, maybe not so much. For many people, this kind of pattern takes months to become visible. Sometimes even years. But for those who naturally pay attention to behavior, these patterns start appearing much earlier. Not because they are overly suspicious or overly critical, but because their brain is constantly connecting dots that most people aren't even collecting. But recognizing patterns over time is one thing. What becomes truly surprising is when that same sensitivity starts showing up in extremely small details. Things most people don't even register as information. And that leads us to the next sign. Sign 6. You notice small details that other people ignore. You walk into a place you've been before, and something immediately catches your attention. A painting that has been moved. The chairs arranged a little differently. The lighting in the room feels slightly changed. Sometimes it's something so subtle that you can't even name it right away. You just feel that something is different. And it is. For most people, these details simply don't exist. The brain filters them out as irrelevant information and moves on. But some minds operate with a different filter. They register small changes in the environment almost automatically, without any conscious effort. It's not something they decide to do. It simply happens. But this goes beyond objects and physical spaces. Some people can pick up something even more subtle. Not what changed in the room, but what is being felt inside it. The entire emotional atmosphere of a place. And that leads us to the next sign. Sign 5. You quickly notice the emotional atmosphere in a room. You walk into a room. Several people are talking. Everything seems normal. But something feels off. A subtle tension in the air that no one has mentioned. A quiet discomfort that isn't in any specific sentence or gesture. But somehow, it's there. You feel it before you understand it. Then a few minutes later, someone casually mentions that two people had an argument before you arrived. You didn't know that. But somehow, you had already sensed it. This happens because human beings are constantly sending emotional signals. Through posture, tone of voice, silence, and even the way they occupy space. Most people don't consciously process all of this. But some minds are constantly reading the emotional atmosphere around them, almost as if there were an internal emotional thermometer always running in the background. And when you notice so much about how people are feeling, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The words people choose rarely tell the whole story. And that leads us to the next sign. Sign 4. You notice when someone's words don't match their behavior. Some people say exactly what others want to hear. They seem kind. They agree with everything. The words sound right, but something doesn't quite fit. Someone says they're happy for you, but they look away at the wrong moment. They say something doesn't bother them, but their tone of voice subtly shifts. The smile appears, but it arrives a second too late. Each detail on its own seems too small to mention, but together, they tell a completely different story from what the words are saying. Psychology has a name for this. Incongruence between what someone says and what their body communicates. Most people don't notice it, because they are listening to the words. But people who pick up on these signals are listening to something else entirely. They're listening to the story that no one is saying out loud. But noticing so many things at once has an effect that very few people talk about. When your mind gathers a lot of information, it doesn't simply switch off when the situation ends. It keeps going. And that leads us to the next sign. Sign 3. People sometimes say that you think too much. You may have heard this before. You think too much. And maybe it happens like this. You leave a conversation, a social situation, a simple interaction. But your mind doesn't move on right away. It goes back to the moment. It starts replaying details. Something someone said. A reaction that felt slightly strange. A silence that lasted a second longer than it should have. While most people have already moved on, you're still there, connecting the dots. In psychology, this has a name: reflective processing. And it's not a flaw. It's a way of thinking that examines experiences more deeply. A mind that looks for patterns where others only see the surface. The problem is that, from the outside, this can look like overthinking. It can look like rumination. Like you simply can't relax. But most of the time, what's actually happening is that your mind is still working. And it rarely works without a reason. And when someone spends so much time observing behaviors, patterns, and emotional reactions in people, a certain ability begins to develop almost unintentionally. The ability to sense when something in a social dynamic is not being said, but is being felt by everyone in the room. And that leads us to the next sign. Sign 2. You notice when someone is trying to manipulate a situation. People's intentions are not always what they seem. Someone may appear extremely friendly, helpful, attentive, but if you pay attention to patterns, you start noticing small strategies happening beneath the surface. The person who always compliments you right before asking for a favor. The one who agrees with everything when you're around, but you already know what they say when you're not. Or someone who completely changes their tone, vocabulary, even their personality depending on who is in the room. Individually, each of these behaviors seems small. But for someone who notices patterns, they form a very clear picture. Psychology refers to this as strategic social behavior. And to some extent, everyone does it. The difference is that some people are able to notice when it's happening. Not because they are naturally suspicious, but because they've seen this pattern before. Many times. After noticing so many details, patterns, and signals over time, one final ability begins to appear. And it might be the hardest one to explain. Because it's not about observing people anymore. It's about sensing something about them, even before there is any clear evidence. And that brings us to sign 1. Sign 1. You begin to understand people through very small signals. Over time, something changes. It's not that you suddenly started paying more attention. It's that certain signals simply stop being invisible. A pause before someone answers. A nearly imperceptible shift in their eyes. A quick gesture that contradicts what was just said. For most people, none of this exists. But for someone who has spent years observing human behavior, sometimes without even realizing they were doing it, these tiny details start telling complete stories. Psychology suggests that most human communication doesn't happen through words. It happens through what isn't said. Through body language. Through silence. Through the timing of a reaction. And some people develop such a refined sensitivity to these signals that they can understand what is happening in a situation before anyone even explains it. It's not magical intuition. It's accumulated attention. It's a brain that has learned to hear what most people filter out as noise. If you recognized yourself in some of these signs, there's a good chance your mind works in a way most people will never fully understand. And yes, sometimes that can feel lonely, but it's also a very rare way of experiencing the world. Now tell me in the comments, do you feel like you notice things that other people miss? Or are you usually the one who only realizes something after someone else points it out? I'm curious to see how many people here truly relate to this.